Welcome to this explainer. Picture, if you will, a colossal chess match. But the board, it's an entire continent, and the stakes are literally the survival of a nation. Today, we're diving into the fascinating clash of military strategies during the American Civil War. We're going to look closely at two very different paths to victory, mapped out by two very different sides. You see, both the Union and the Confederacy entered this brutal conflict with clear, calculated plans they were absolutely certain would win the day. But, as history constantly reminds us, an idea on paper is very, very different from execution on the battlefield.
But before a single shot was even fired or a single army marched, leaders on both sides had to face a universal truth. As the book of Luke asks, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost?" It's so true, right? You just can't blindly march into a conflict of this massive scale. You have to evaluate your resources, understand your geography, and calculate exactly what it'll take to reach your ultimate goals.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. Number 1, counting the cost. 2, the Anaconda Plan. 3, the defensive strategy. 4, geography and resources. 5, the shift to total war. And finally, 6, education and morality.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, counting the cost and why planning matters.
Look, both the Union and the Confederacy entered this war with wildly different game plans. And those plans, they directly reflected their own unique strengths and weaknesses. Now, a brilliant strategy doesn't necessarily guarantee a win, but marching forward without one, that pretty much guarantees defeat. Understanding these two distinct strategies is absolutely the key to understanding how the Civil War was ultimately won and lost.
Moving right along to section 2, the Anaconda Plan, or squeezing the South. Now, you're probably wondering, what in the world does a giant snake have to do with fighting a war? It sounds a little bizarre at first, right? Why name a massive military operation after a huge jungle reptile? Well, the name actually hits the nail on the head. The goal was quite literally to squeeze the South into submission. General Winfield Scott realized the Union didn't actually have to charge headfirst into Southern territory right off the bat. Instead, much like a massive constrictor snake wrapping around its prey, they could just surround the Confederacy, cut off their access to the outside world, and slowly but surely strangle their ability to sustain an army. So General Scott laid out 3 aggressive steps to make this happen. Step 1, set up a massive naval blockade all along the southern coast, basically starving them of imported weapons and supplies. Step 2, take complete control of the Mississippi River. Think of the Mississippi as the main artery of the South. Taking it would effectively slice the Confederacy right down the middle, separating states like Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest. And finally, step 3, capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, to deal a crushing political and psychological blow. Let's flip the scripts now with section 3, the defensive strategy, and waiting it out. Okay, so if the North was aggressively squeezing, why on earth did the South just want to sit back and wait? I mean, it seems super passive, right? Honestly, from a strategic standpoint, it made complete sense for their situation. They knew they were heavily outnumbered and outsupplied, so their whole goal was to just frustrate the North until Union public opinion turned against the war entirely. The reality on the ground was pretty stark. The North had the factories, they had the railroads, and they had a massive population advantage. The Confederacy understood they couldn't win a traditional offensive war of conquest. Instead, they just had to not lose. If they could drag the fighting out and make it incredibly expensive in both money and human lives, their hope was that the Northern public would simply get exhausted and demand their government give up. This defensive waiting game relied on a few critical tactics. First off, fiercely hold their own territory and force the Union armies to march exhausting distances away from their supply lines. But the real wild card here was international politics, specifically King Cotton. You see, the South produced a staggering amount of cotton, which the textile mills over in Britain and France desperately needed. The Confederacy banked on the hope that if they just held out long enough, those cotton-starved European nations would be forced to intervene, recognize them as an independent country, and send military aid just to keep the cotton flowing. Which brings us to Section 4, Geography and Resources, the Clash of Strengths. When you break it down, the Union totally leveraged its massive factories and strong existing navy to execute that coastal blockade. On the flip side, the Confederacy's defensive strategy was rooted entirely in a home field advantage. They were fighting in their own backyards. They used their deep knowledge of the local terrain, every single road, river, and hiding spot, to successfully outmaneuver a much larger invading force for a very long time. All right, Section 5, the shift to total war and breaking the infrastructure. Now, as we all know, plans rarely survive actual contact with the enemy. The Union soon realized that merely squeezing wasn't enough. The Anaconda Plan was working, sure, but it was agonizingly slow, and the war was dragging on with absolutely horrific casualties. This evolution brings us to a really heavy question. What exactly is total war? How do you go from fighting armies on a battlefield to waging war on an entire region?
Well, the goal became completely breaking the South's infrastructure and resources. They targeted everything that allowed the enemy to keep fighting. This was a brutal escalation. The Union leadership realized that defeating Confederate armies in the field just wasn't cutting it. If Southern farms were still producing food, factories were still pumping out boots, and trains were still delivering ammo. Total war meant tearing up those railroad tracks, burning down factories, and destroying crops. It was a conscious, deliberate decision to bring the economic and logistical backbone of the Confederacy to a grinding halt.
And ultimately, this devastating shift to total war meant the Confederacy simply ran out of the ability to sustain that defensive strategy. Think about it. You cannot hold a defensive line, no matter how well you know the terrain, if your soldiers are starving, their boots are falling apart, and they have literally no ammunition for their rifles. The Anaconda Plan set the stage by cutting off the outside world, but it was this brutal reality of total war that finally broke the Confederacy's capacity to continue the fight.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, Education and Morality, bringing in insights from the Godly Learners series.
So, we've unpacked a lot of history today, but let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture of our own learning journey. Because learning about these massive historical conflicts isn't just about memorizing facts and troop movements. It's about understanding the human condition and the choices we make. As taught in the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learner series, it is absolutely crucial to intertwine education with biblical morality. When we look at the sheer destruction caused by the Civil War, the brilliance of the generals, and the pure ingenuity of their strategies, we really have to ask ourselves what happens when intellect operates in a vacuum. The philosophy here is profound. Education, no matter how advanced, without a foundation of morality, will inevitably lead to hurt.
I mean, think about it. What is the actual point of being incredibly smart and highly educated if you make choices that just end up hurting people? Brilliant military strategies might win wars for sure, but without moral grounding, pure intellect often leads to some seriously destructive choices. What good is being capable of designing a complex, nationwide military campaign if those talents bring about massive suffering? We see it time and time again throughout history. Intellect completely disconnected from spiritual and moral responsibility often yields incredibly tragic results. But by engaging with history through a spiritual lens, we actually find a promise of true peace. Romans chapter 8 promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their mind spiritual. As you continue to learn, to grow, and to build your own towers of knowledge, I strongly encourage you to count the cost. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer today, and I want to leave you with this one final thought. Moving forward, will you let your intellect be guided by a moral compass?